paper. I was saying I did try the other day ad-libbing online and it didn't work at all. So forgive me if this is a little bit scripted, but I hope it works. So as Elaine says, this is coming out of a book that I'd hoped to finish last year when I was in Paris, but that got very interrupted. So I'll hope to finish it early into the new year. What I'm looking at is the focus on rhythm in late 19th and early 20th century culture, which was consolidated in disciplines or proto-disciplines like which were called rhythmics and rhythm science. And these dominated a number of fields of study, including the life sciences, philosophy, psychology, music, and literature. So one of the things I'm arguing is that at a time of increasing specialization, rhythm became a connective tissue between these areas of knowledge and between the arts and sciences more broadly. Writers on the topic looked back to classical philosophy and prosody, in which rhythm or its cognates was a central term and organizing principle, while at the same time they gathered up developments in experimental psychology and in physiological aesthetics, or what the 19th century philosopher and scientist Herbert Spencer called aesthophysiology. So as I've said, my aim in my larger study is to trace the multifarious interrelations between movements and currents of opinion in the arts, including poetry, dance, art and film, and the sciences in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, in which rhythm played a central part, and to explore the determinants of what I'm thinking of as the cult of rhythm in the period. In the background are a sense of dramatic change linked to the coming of the new century, the accelerating rhythms of work and transport, the conflict between theories of progress and decline, and the rise of anti-materialist currents of spiritualism, in which both materialists and spiritualists, in their different ways, shared a sense of the unity between the individual and the rest of the cosmos. Now, the understanding of rhythm as movement and becoming can be traced through from Nietzsche to Henri Bergson, whose conceptions of creative evolution was a response to Spencer's mostly more mechanical conception, and his modernist followers and detractors in literature and the visual arts. Bergson's celebrity lectures, as well as his writings, were the source, of course, of much literary and artistic production in France and elsewhere. Concepts of continuity, movement, rhythm, personality, and self-realization were associated with Bergsonism on both sides of the Channel and beyond. Writings on rhythm also became, as in so much turn-of-the-century thought, a way of linking the ancient and the modern, and the relationship of late Victorian and modernist writers and thinkers to classical aesthetics and culture, it was a central one. It was fundamental to Nietzsche's distinctions between the rhythms of classical and modern thought, which came to define the different concepts of time, historicity, and cultural formation in the two periods. Now, in relation to the classical period, a key text of 1951 by the French linguist Émile Benveniste traces the term rhythm through classical Greek thought, from an initial sense of form and order captured in motion in the thought of the pre-Socratics to that given it by Plato. Here, the term is attached to successive movements, particularly those of bodies, which in Socrates' reported formulation are numerically regulated and must be called rhythms and measures. The opposition between pre-Socratic form and Platonic metric structures all subsequent discussion of the topic in Western thought. In the specific case of poetics, it appears in the ongoing controversies between theorists who distinguish sharply between rhythm and meter and those who stress their affinity. Now, rhythm is conventionally defined as pertaining to a sequence of events which can be perceived as a pattern with an interplay between repetition and variation or grouping. It appears in philosophy, aesthetics, and literary theory in two overlapping forms. The more precise sense covers issues of musical and poetic and prose rhythm, and by extension, natural rhythms such as those of water, the planets, human and other animal bodies, and the rhythms of architecture, work, and so on. These are brought together in a broader sense in which rhythm is seen as a pervasive and dominant feature of the universe and its contents, expressed in, for example, Friedrich Hölderlin's assertion that all is rhythm, or the musician Hans von Bülow's much quoted "in the beginning was rhythm." More tentatively, Jacques Derrida suggested that rhythm has always haunted our tradition without ever reaching the center of its concerns. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus first on the interplay of science and poetics broadly conceived in discussions of rhythm around the turn of the century, and secondly, on the idea of a specifically American rhythm in the 1920s. So I'll start with rhythm studies, science, and aesthetics. So throughout my larger study, I'm examining the ways in which early 20th century writers, artists, and theorists, and those who played a central role in establishing literary and artistic movements, drew on concepts of rhythm which were largely established in the second half of the 19th century and into that century's turn. Rhythm became, in the American philosopher John Dewey's phrase, the tie between science and aesthetics, linking natural and environmental rhythms, the movements of physical matter, the processes and patterns of mental life, and the periodicities of human sexuality to the rhythmic patterns of art, poetry, art, and music. My concern in this context is less with metrical or musical structures as such, than with the ways in which explorations in psychology, in particular experimental psychology, intersected with responses to the arts, forging new developments in what was called physiological aesthetics, and with the part played by the concept of rhythm in these. I address the ways in which human subjects, I address the ways in which the experimental subject of psychology and the receptive subject of aesthetics became defined as a rhythmical subject. And the title of my book is going to be Rhythmical Subjects, and that is implying both the subject of rhythm and what was at stake in being a rhythmical subject in this period. In First Principles of a New System of Philosophy of 1862, the scientist and philosopher Herbert Spencer argued for the omnipresence of rhythm, building up from the physical world and its laws to the realms of social organization and human creative activity. Rhythmical action, he writes, is to be found in the impact of a rising breeze on a becalmed vessel, or on land, in the conflict between the current of air and the things it meets. He writes, the blades of grass and dried bents in the meadows, and still better, the stalks in the neighboring cornfields, exhibit the same rising and falling movement. For Spencer, all motion is rhythmical, and the physical universe exists in a mode of perpetual motion, which he defines in terms of, quote, a conflict of forces, not in equilibrium. He writes, if the antagonist forces are at any point are balanced, there is rest, and in the absence of motion, there can, of course, be no rhythm. The extended analogies he deployed in exploring the rhythm of motion included, as it did for many other rhythm scientists, the example of the seashore and the compound rhythm of waves, capturing apprehensions of rhythm, of the origins of rhythm as term and concept, as linked to wave formations. While the etymology of rhythm, and I won't go into this in detail, from the Greek ren, R-H-E-I-N, to flow, was subsequently contested, as in the article by Benveniste I mentioned earlier, in which he argued that the association between rhythm and the movement of the sea was inaccurate. So he was saying that for the Greeks, to flow, it was associated with the movement of water, say, in a river, but it was not associated with the movement of waves, with the repetition of the waves, in which the association became. But the connection I'm arguing, even if the etymology is not correct, the connection is both long-standing and formative. Complex and compound rhythm was also frequently contrasted with a more basic measure, beat, meter, or takt, a distinction which is central to rhythm studies. Now, Spencer located rhythm not only at the largest levels in, for example, geographical processes, but in the bodily processes of each individual organism, and in human consciousness, whose rhythm he defined in the terms of a departure and return from and to mental states and feelings. A more conspicuous rhythm, having longer waves, he argued, is seen during the outflow of emotion into dancing, poetry, and music. The current of mental energy that shows itself in these modes of bodily action is not continuous, but falls into a succession of pulses. So the rhythmic dimensions of aesthetic expression start from the body and the bodily discharge of feeling. And the naturalness is proven by the fact that they are also revealed in the cadences, the rise and fall of ordinary speech. In evoking the rhythmic nature of the three arts, Spencer pointed to patterns of alternation and recurrence, again using in his illustration of music the motif of waves. There are the recurring beats, he writes, in each of which there is a primary and secondary beat. There is the alternate increase and decrease of muscular strain, implied by the ascents and descents to the higher and lower notes. Ascents and descents composed of smaller waves, breaking the rises and falls of the larger ones in a mode peculiar to each melody. Rises and falls are also central to Spencer's account of rhythm in all the phenomena of life. If each species of organism be regarded as a whole, he writes, it displays two different kinds of rhythm, the specific movement of its lifespan and the variation of its patterns of increase and decline, which make it sufficiently clear that life on the earth has not progressed uniformly, but in immense undulations. Consciousness and artistic expression are the product, mental and bodily, of currents of energy which fall again into a succession of pulses. The model of rise and fall of force or energy to patterns of migration in human societies, to the movements of exchange, supply and demand, and financial markets, and to the rhythms of social change in religion, philosophy, and fashion. And I don't talk about it in this paper, but I think one could trace a relationship between this and the rhythm analysis of Henri Lefebvre, which is what I end my book with. Spencer's writings on the universality of rhythm were echoed in the work of a range of writers from science, philosophy, psychology, literature, and the arts. And here, as in numerous other contexts, Spencer's writings on rhythm function to connect poetic and natural rhythms and to move technical and specialized analyses into cosmic or on occasion metaphysical or spiritual realms. His terms and concepts were significant for further dimensions of rhythmics. One, exemplified in his focus on the bodily discharge of feeling, was the centrality of rhythm to what is called the kinesthetics and physiological aesthetics, which developed in the late 19th century in the work of thinkers including the science writer Grant Allen, the psychologist Havelock Ellis, and the philosopher and novelist Vernon Lee. A related line of exploration was that of the impact of theorizations of rhythm in its definitions as pulsation, conflict of force, continuous motion, and rise and fall on the aesthetic theories and literature of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Now, I'm moving to a section on the importance of rhythm in the psychological laboratory. Herbert Spencer and Grant Allen, following him, pursued their synthetic and deductive science at a far remove from the scientific laboratory. This was, however, where the relationship between science and aesthetics in the emerging field of psychophysiology was newly and significantly shaped from the mid-19th century onwards. So we have a connection between physiology and psychology that Spencer opens up, that were developed into an experimental research program by Wilhelm Wundt, author of the highly influential study, The Principles of Physiological Psychology of 1874, and he was founder of the first psychological institute in 1879 in Leipzig, And here this established the methods and practices of the psychological laboratory. And scientific apparatuses, including recording devices, serve to ensure the precision of measurements, primarily responses to stimuli, sensory, auditory, and visual. And these included the kymograph, or wave writer, from the Greek swell or wave, and graphein, writing. So Wundt saw rhythm and melody in music as shedding light on the perception of time. A zero intensity of sound is received as a rhythmic pause, while varying intensities of sound, if they take place with some regularity, are apprehended as rhythmical. Greater or lesser volumes are described as taking the form of the arsis and thesis, the stronger and weaker parts of a musical measure or a poetic foot. So auditory rhythms, as measured in the laboratory, became closely tied to music and prosody. And the terms were also central to Wundt's theories of time consciousness and duration. He said we can only assess the timing of an event with any accuracy if it takes rhythmic form. So in broad terms, experimental psychologists focusing on the topic of rhythm in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I should perhaps pause to say that this was one of the main things they were exploring. There were some 800 articles written on the topic in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. So it's become an immense topic of interest. So they were exploring concepts of natural rhythm in consciousness or attention, intermittency, and the apprehension of rhythmic groupings. And explorations of rhythm and rhythmicity were for the most part closely connected to research into related but not identical topics, such as duration, attention, and memory and expectation. And these issues were central to the work of William James, whose writings helped introduce Wundt's ideas to an Anglophone readership in his Principles of Psychology of 1890. William James described exercises in introspection which were intended to assess the subjective experience of the passage of time and the inward immersion in what Wundt called the twilight of our general consciousness. Slightly hefty quote from William James coming up, which I will gloss. So James writes, "Our heartbeats, our breathing, the pulses of our attention, fragments of words or sentences that pass through our imagination are what people this dim habitat. Now, all these processes are rhythmical and are apprehended by us as they occur in their totality. The breathing and pulses of attention as coherent successions, each with its rise and fall. The heartbeat similarly, only relatively far more brief. The words not separately, but in connected groups. In short, empty our minds as we may, some form of changing process remains for us to feel and cannot be expelled. And along with the sense of the process and its rhythm goes the sense of the length of time it lasts." So James thus understood consciousness, which for him is time consciousness, as inherently rhythmical, its elements composed of the involuntary and physiological, the heartbeat and respiration, the semi-conscious or semi-volitional pulses of attention, and linguistic fragments that pass through our imagination. Consciousness for James is a stream, but as Wundt had indicated, the flow of empty time is told off or measured in pulses. James likened it to a bird's flight, an alternation of flights and perches, which the rhythms of language express. Now, I'll just say something briefly about one of the most significant contributions to rhythm science, which was that of the American experimental psychologist Thaddeus Bolton. And in discussing physiological rhythms, he invoked the involuntary actions of the pulse and respiration. and those habits which also take on involuntary form, instanced by walking and speech. The question of rhythmic speech led to the discussion of poetry. Bolton speculated on the origins of language in the rhythms of dance and explored the play of poetic rhythm, including the theses and arses of the verse, of accented, unaccented syllables, and the historical shift from alliteration to rhythm. So more broadly, the rise of rhythm studies in experimental psychology of the late 19th century was closely linked to a proliferation of texts on meter and metrical form. So this is where science and art is coming together. And this proliferation of texts on meter and metrical form has recently been explored in relation to conceptions of national poetics and prosody, including debates over the ideological import of the choice of metrical measures and the applicability or otherwise of classical meters to English verse forms. American literary critics were particularly likely to argue for the need to study vernacular rather than classical versification, and to work with stresses and accents rather than syllabic quantities. The connection was frequently drawn between the poetic vernacular, the cadences of speech, and the naturalness of rhythm. As in one critic, James C. Parsons' account of rhythm in his English versification, which, like so many other works in the field, defined rhythm as recurrence, giving as habitual example the swelling and sinking of a wave. He writes, "A succession of crests and hollows forms a rhythm. So of the voice, it pulsates loudly and then softly, and the succession of loud and soft syllables forms a rhythm." The studies of rhythm that continued into the early 20th century offered variations on the methods and apparatuses established by Wundt, at times seeking to divorce studies of rhythm from researches into time and duration, attention, and the span of consciousness. So whereas, as I said, for William James, rhythm is absolutely part of the study of time, duration, attention, and consciousness, others were attempting to isolate the phenomenon of rhythmic apprehension and to seek a definition of the nature of rhythm quite separate from those concerns. There was also an increased focus following the German economist Karl Bucher's study, Arbeit und Rhythmus, Work and Rhythm, on the significance of rhythm in the context of labor, the drive for industrial efficiency, and concerns over the fatigue to which the human motor was subject. This dimension of rhythm science was linked to the argument that whereas from early Greek mythology to the present, views of rhythm had been based on the assumption that rhythm is instinctive, rhythm in general is the result of habit, and as it was acquired and not inherited, was susceptible for training. This views had implications for work rhythm studies as an aspect of developments in the modern industrial and factory system, and for the new spiritual and artistic movements, which were dedicated to correcting the arrhythmia of the modern age. So arrhythmia was seen as part of modern neurasthenia, and it could be corrected by rhythmical movements. And in this context, I'm looking particularly at the dance and movement studies of Dalcroze in Switzerland and in Germany. In another important innovation, the experimental psychologist Christian Rückmich explored the role of what I mentioned, kinesthesis. So kinesthetic sensation, which is the presence of sensations of movement or strain, one's perception of one's own bodily movements. And Rückmich's laboratory experiments focused on these organic, visceral and muscular sensations and the auditory and visual imagery produced by auditory exposure to rhythmic sequences. And kinesthesia becomes very important for example, the writing and the experiments with aesthetic response of Vernon Lee, whose work people may be familiar with. So briefly, to the literary man in the psychological laboratory. So scientific and psychological explorations of rhythm entered writings, as I've suggested, on prosody in the early 20th century. And there's recently been quite a lot of work on the psychologist Jean-Pierre Rousselot, who developed a system. He was a linguist, a linguistic experimenter. He developed a system of experimental phonetics using both the aforementioned chimograph, the wave writer, and an instrument called the phonoscope, which was sometimes clipped to the subject's face. I should really have an image here, so as to connect to the lips, tongue, thorax, larynx, teeth, or nostrils. This turned, it sounds incredibly uncomfortable, this turned spoken sounds into a visible trace cut onto a metal cylinder and represented pitch and other properties. And these are the rhythmic muscular cycles described by Rousselot as tension, retention, release. Modernist writers, including Apollinaire and Ezra Pound, recorded recitations on Rousselot's phonoscope, and as a number of recent critics, including Michael Goldstein and Hans Saucy, have shown, these activities became important elements in what Lacey is writing about, the legitimation of the free verse movement, revealing the presence of vocal rhythms despite the absence of traditional metrical schemes. Now, the chimograph was also an important element in the long-forgotten British classicist E.A. Sonnenschein study, What is Rhythm, of 1925, described by Harriet Monroe, writer, editor, and powerful advocate for and enabler of modernist literature, including James Joyce's Ulysses, as we know. She describes Sonnenschein's study, What is Rhythm, as a masterly treatise, which should relegate all the old confusing errors to the dusty past. Well, Sonnenschein has himself sadly become part of the dusty past, but he was primarily concerned with rhythm in classical and English verse, but he also revealed an awareness of rhythm studies and experimental psychology, including approaches to work rhythm and efficiency. So I am finding it really interesting to find out that these people who, classicists, linguists, literary people, were so aware of what had been going on or what was going on in the psychological laboratory at this time, and were drawing on this for their theories of prosody. So time and the relative duration of events was for Sonnenschein the fundamental feature of rhythm, and this model allowed him to bring together the approaches of classical philosophy and of modern psychology. He pointed to the importance of empty intervals in rhythmic structures. These were called by the Greeks empty times, and were, in Sonnenschein's words, events in time just as much as the measured sensations by which they are bounded. So this approach to rhythm would be taken up by a number of later 20th century philosophers and theorists who focused on spacing and caesura and on the in-between in rhythmical structures. For Derrida, there is no simple beginning, no rhythm without repetition, spacing, caesura. Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaux insist that rhythm is not meter or cadence. There is nothing less rhythmic than a military march, and also locate rhythm as the in-between. They write, there is rhythm whenever there is a transcoded passage from one milieu to another, a communication of milieu, coordination between heterogeneous space-times. Gaston Bachelard opposed the Bergsonian thesis of a continuously, regularly flowing duration with his arguments for the existence of lacunae in duration and the concept of rhythm. In our opinion, he writes in his critique of Bergson, psychic continuity poses a problem, and it seems to us impossible not to recognize the need to base complex life on a plurality of durations that have neither the same rhythm nor the same solidity in their sequence, nor the same power of continuity. That is, for Bachelard, time and its rhythms is multiple, vertical, and dialectical. Now, returning to Sonnenschein, in What is Rhythm, he referred to the University of Columbia professor of literature William Morrison Patterson's The Rhythms of Prose, published in 1916. Patterson, like Herbert Spencer, located rhythm in every dimension of experience, from the child on the swing to the investor who is subject to the movements of capital. For psychology, however, he wrote, not only rhythmic swing, but rhythm in general has figured as a riddle. He introduced into the experiments not only musical arrangements, and here he was particularly interested in the new forms of syncopation and sense of swing provided by, for example, ragtime, but also sentences from Henry James and Walter Pater. His focus on prose rhythm is a significant one, shaped by a concern with rhythm as a universal phenomenon. Prose rhythm, which is understood as closer to ordinary language than is poetry, was part of this context. And the naturalness of rhythm becomes fully identified with both the rhythmic patternings of prose forms and the everyday rhythms of life. But at the same time, distinctions between prose and poetic forms had become less absolute at the time Patterson was working and writing. Developments in free verse were blurring the divide, while modernist prose writers such as Virginia Woolf were pointing to the future of fiction as lying in its increasingly poetic nature. Rhythmic patterns were understood to pre-exist in the creative process, the words that would come to clothe them, so that rhythm was perceived to be prior to and more fundamental than meaning or signification. This view was supported and in some contexts shaped by the approaches of science and psychology, with, as in Spencer's writings, the concept of rhythm as emotional speech, and in the work of experimental psychologists, from Wundt onwards, theories of the essentially rhythmic nature of consciousness and the human capacity for rhythmization. For Harriet Monroe, reading Patterson's study was like going home after a long journey. From childhood, she wrote, I have groped among rhythms strongly felt, but difficult to analyze. It has seemed to me obvious that not verse alone is rhythmical, but that prose also, whether on the page or the tongue, is bound to follow the universal law of rhythm. So following work by Bolton, Ruknick and others, Patterson explored the various levels of a sense of rhythm in a group of experimental subjects using an arsenal of devices. And he took up the theme of subjective perception of objectively unrhythmical sequences, and this he called subjective rhythmization. So you hear, for example, the example that's always given is the tick, tick, tick of a clock, which we hear as a tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. So that would be a very basic example of subjective rhythmization. Or hearing rhythms in the rhythms of the rails, the rhythms of train sounds, which we turn into a melody or turn into a tune. Again, an example of subjective rhythmization. Patterson was particularly concerned with the reclamation of what he termed the lost art of rhythm. And this preoccupation is linked to the cultural and artistic movements that I discuss in my broader project, and to the identifications made between the arrhythmical or unrhythmical and the neurasthenic personality. So Patterson, who I do not love for most of his attitudes, refers disparagingly to the self-conscious individual who finds himself a prey to the inhibitions of modern society, who dares not climb a tree or handle an axe, whose natural rhythmic response is attenuated, and whose images of time are consequently blurred, whose coordinating processes are so obstructed that it is impossible for syncopation to be instinctively enjoyed or even understood. Such individuals, he suggests, would be incapable of responding to the rhythms of prose, which they would see only as the mere negation of verse. By contrast, those individuals whom Patterson describes as aggressively rhythmic, and that's a good thing to be aggressively rhythmic, musicians would fall into this category, are capable, he writes, of feeling a consistent and continuous experience when confronted with haphazard sounds of any nature. But he also suggests that those without this innate capacity might, through training, acquire fuller capacities for rhythmic experience. He points out the stakes in rhythmical identity and the perception that rhythmical being, which he associates with a physical fearlessness that he saw as attenuated in a modern nervous cerebral age, was the condition for a full existence and engagement with the world. And in 1916, he collaborated with poet and editor Amy Lowell in experiments in the laboratory conditions at Columbia University on the rhythmic properties of the new poetry, with Lowell contributing, in Patterson's words, readings of what she considers typical vers libre. The coincidence, he writes, between the listener's hearer's physiologically developed time sense and the chief accents in her delivery of the lines marks the experience psychologically as verse, regardless of the absence of metrical pattern in the consciousness of the listener. The rhythms or tunes of prose, by contrast, are experienced as syncopation and readily recognized by our intuitive processes. The experience of rhythm, the world's big and little waves of sound, are regulated, Patterson writes, by the timer's internal waves of living, what he calls a hypnotizing inner surge that is externalized in the dynamic boom, boom, boom of the Indian's tom-tom, the plunk-plunk of our ancestral harpists, or the unitary drone of the medieval monks, intoxicated with the swing of their Gregorian chants. And I have a long quote from Patterson, which I will gloss. So what he's saying is that this intuitive response to complicated syncopation, which he says is possessed by what he calls savages, has been lost to so many of us through the inhibiting influences of sedentary life. But it is surely requisite, he says, to rhythmical technique in writing prose and verse. But if we want to regain this instinctive response, we have to resort to physical means. That the gift resides not in our minds as such, but in our bodies. We have to become intuitively conscious of the time values involved in syncopation. We can put a finger on our pulse or a hand over our heart and thus measure our breathing and its segments, etc., etc. So you train yourself into rhythmical apprehension and rhythmical creativity through an attention to the rhythms of the body, to put it briefly. So he traced an account of rhythmic patterns as they developed in the centuries of literary history, from Old English poetry, in which accents were marked by alliteration, through to the poetry of the present. Again, I'll gloss. He's particularly referring to the syncopating experience of vers libre and to Amy Lowell's what she called polyphonic prose, which brings together unitary verse and syncopated experience. He says we are particularly indebted to those of our contemporaries who've instinctively composed in these genres and thus helped us so materially to hear not only the music of everyday language, the rhythm of its prose, but also its ancestral cadence, the forgotten swing of unitary verse. This was, in his words, a lost child of our house of rhythm, and in using it in your newest songs, we hear quite suddenly the harp of our ancestors. So, to put it very briefly, it is the idea that in the most modern of verse, we are hearing the music of the ancients. Both Lowell and Patterson, Amy Lowell and Patterson, understood individuals to be differentially rhythmical subjects. As I've said, Patterson wrote of individuals whose mental and physical reactions may be described as aggressively rhythmic, a label Amy Lowell was quick to attach to herself. And he contrasted these persons with those who are deficient in rhythmic aggressiveness. He opened his work with the assertion that the music of what he termed contemporary savages taunts us with a lost art of rhythm, a facility for rhythmic being, and for the execution of syncopating rhythms, such as is to be found in the American Indian, who is, but these rhythms have been inhibited by modern sophistication and conventional dignity. The fact that individuals can be trained in the production of syncopated rhythm should, however, Patterson argued, lessen our awe at the American Indians' creation of complex rhythms. Our astonishment, he writes, should be directed not so much at their having perpetuated what is, after all, a fairly simple trick, as our own stupidity in losing the trick. Now, I'll move more briefly through my final section. The cultural background to Patterson's discussion is the intense concern with the question of American identity and culture in the early decades of the 20th century. In what was called in 1932 the rising national consciousness, art and literature were as important as political and social legislation and discourse, evidenced in part in the regionalism and fascination with indigeneity of the period. And the period saw numerous publications which sought for ways to imagine a regeneration for what was perceived as a deadened present, materialistic and machine-driven. And one of the things I'm looking at is the creation of communities seeking alternative values, which had been part of American culture over centuries. The making of the artistic colonies that developed in America's Southwest in the first decades of the 20th century, notably at Santa Fe and Taos and New Mexico, and to which American Indian culture, or at least imaginings of this culture, was central. As Walter Ben Michaels has argued, the American Indian in the 1920s became both a model of genuine culture and community, and the exemplary instance of what it means no longer to have a culture. And the concept of a lost rhythm and the means of its recovery was central in this context. And in this context, I'm looking at Harriet Monroe's contemporaries, including Mabel Dodge Lewin, Mary Austin, and D.H. Lawrence, and their responses to a culture perceived as vanishing, with a focus on the fundamental role of rhythm as expressed in poetry and dance in particular. And I'll turn now to the writer Mary Austin, who may not be very familiar to people born in 1868. And she studied sciences before a family moved to California. In 1903, she published her book, The Land of Little Rain, which was a work of naturist writing about the Mojave Desert. In 1904, she joined the writers' colony at Carmel, California, and she became increasingly well-known as a lecturer and writer. She traveled in Europe, moved in New York circles during and after the First World War. In the early 1920s, Mary Austin relocated to the Southwest, committing herself increasingly to the study and translation of Native American Indian arts and songs. She visited Mabel Dodge Lewin in Taos before settling in Santa Fe in 1924 until her death in 1934. And she established herself as a significant member of the New Mexico colony, involved in Society for the Revival of Spanish Arts and the Indian Arts Funds. And this was at a time of intense political activism over the preservation of Indian lands, customs, and communities, at a point when they were deeply threatened by land grab bills, amongst other depredations on their culture and community. Now, in 1923, she wrote a book study called The American Rhythm. And part of that book, it contained what she called her re-expressions, which were retranscriptions rather than direct translations of Native American Indian poetry. The dimension of the work is very significant, but I'm not going to have time to explore it in this talk, other than to note the intense interest in Indigenous poetry evinced by a range of contemporary writers, many of whom drew connections between its forms and those of free verse and imagist poetics. So I'm more fully concerned for the moment with Austin's broader theories of rhythm and their connections to other rhythm theories of the period. She opened her book with an account of rhythm as experience that called upon many of the central terms of rhythm science. It seems likely that she'd read Patterson's The Rhythms of Prose, and also the American critic Francis Gumere's work on poetry's communal origins, and what Gumere called the communal human sympathy of rhythm, so the idea that rhythm has a communitarian function. Like Patterson, Gumere was influenced by Kohlbucher's rhythm and work. So Austen refers in words that strongly echo those of Herbert Spencer to the rhythmic forms arising fortuitously in our environment as the roll of thunder or the run of wind in tall grass, and to an account of what she called the suggestibility of the human organism in the direction of rhythmic response. The major rhythms, she writes, of the human organism are given by the blood and the breath. An instinctive rhythm is a habit of response, she says, of which the initiative is lost. Being lost is one of the conditions of our making poetry of it. Now, she had a long theory that, a long expanded theory that where American had taken a wrong turn, where American creative life had taken a wrong turn was in looking back to English-speaking verse forms, which she calls the rhythms of privilege, and not to the indigenous poetry of America, which she says was the only poetry fitted to American settlement. So the idea is that America had, she says, carried on its back the shape of the derived culture on England, but that they should be attentive to the new forces shaping it. It was back, she writes, to, I'm sorry, I feel an idiot quoting Mary Austen, but it's the way she writes. It was back to the foot pace on the new earth, axe stroke and paddle stroke. So it is that new rhythms are born of new motor impulses. So migration, motion, body, and landscape become the interacting forces that shape for her national becoming, though she's more insistent on indigeneity than on transformation. But the shaping force of environment, and hence the possibility of adaptation, was central to her writings and deeply intertwined with rhythm. Streams of rhythmic sights and sound, she says, flowed in upon the becoming race of America from every natural feature. Life set itself to new processions of seed time and harvest, the very blood humming to new altitudes, the rhythm of horseback riding, of a rise and fall distinctively of the American continent, superseded the foot pace. Now and then, Austen writes, one picks up this rhythm in the work of contemporary poets, Vachel Lindsay and Carl Sandburg. But she says we would have picked up this heritage of rhythms much earlier if we hadn't put our, I'm paraphrasing here, if we hadn't put our young people through the ancient paces of classical and English rhythms of privilege. She takes a distance from the widely held view that Walt Whitman was an avatar of an American rhythm. She writes that his rhythms are more often than not mere unpatterned noises of the streets. And we might contrast this, to take one example, with the critic F.O. Matheson's discussions of Whitman in the American Renaissance of 1940, which stressed the poet's continually repeated statement that he wanted in his poems such, quote, subtle indirection as came to him from the movement of the sea and the sibilance of the waves rolling in without intermission and fitfully rising and falling, in Whitman's words. So Mary Austen turns to the what she calls the American rhythms of the indigenous Americans, who she calls the Amerindians. All the time, she writes, there was an American race singing in tune with the beloved environment, to the measures of life-sustaining gestures, out of the democratic experience, profound desire of man, etc., as it does, I can't quote this, to assimilate himself to the allness as it is displayed to him in all the peacock splendor of the American continent. She found in tribal poetry a communal song more highly developed than any form of personal expression. Mimesis, she argues, lies at the origins of poetry. Consciousness is beaten into synchronous waves by the rhythmic impact, and the track of the first poetic line is laid in the group mind. And she talks also about the rhythmic series of our American Indians' poetic dance dramas. She also referred to the intricate variations and embellishments of Afro-American rhythms that go by the name of jazz, but she found in these modern versions a form of spiritual disintegration by contrast with the life affirmation of the American Indian. She also points to what she calls an extraordinary, unprecedented likeness between the works of such writers as Amy Lowell, Carl Sandburg, Rachel Lindsay, and Edgar Lee Masters. And so she's finding a connection between the indigenous poetry and the work of the new poets, some of whom were involved with the free verse movement, others like Sandburg and Lindsay to some extent with imagism, and she's finding that in them a common root, which she is saying is based in the common urge towards communality and the shared stream of what she says is rhythmic stimuli proceeding from the environment, which creates a similarity of form between the early and later American poets. Now, I was surprised in my first discovery, as it were, of Mary Austin's American Rhythm to find how very widely reviewed and discussed it was, both in its 1923 and 1930 editions, realizing how strongly it must have spoken to some of the central cultural and literary debates of the time for all its eccentricities. So the cultural historian Waldo Frank, and to an extent William Carlos Williams in the American Grain, were also arguing that migration, environment, and bodily experiences were the interacting forces that shaped national becoming and a national literature. In a slightly different vein, one critic wrote, endorsing Austin's account of the concept of the rhythm of the region, the landscape of Southwest America, quote, this is a critic called Henry Smith writing in 1931, you cannot see, hear, taste, smell, or touch the rhythm of an environment. Knowledge of it must be acquired otherwise than through the senses or through any combination of sensory experience. And I found this concept of a form of knowledge which isn't transmitted through or mediated by sensory experience an interesting one, suggesting that rhythmic apprehension was to be understood as a sixth sense, perhaps, reinforcing the idea of rhythm as at once fundamental and as indefinable or uncircumscribable. So, as I've said, there were many reviews of Austin's book, some laudatory, others highly satirical, substantial responses to it from such well-known cultural commentators of the time as Lewis Mumford, at the time assistant editor of the journal The Dial, an important writer on utopia, urban society, technology and machine culture, from Carl and Mark Van Doren, again, highly regarded literary critics, and the poet and critic Louis Untermeyer. So Mumford was not unhappy with the argument that he said, if organic rhythms are at the bottom of all poetry, they are there because they're at the bottom of all experience, and that the rhythms of work in pre-modern societies were manifested in poetry and drama and dance. But he took issue with Austin's brand of American exceptionalism, and he also noted the variety of American environments, saying, you know, how can you conflate the prairie and the city? There is no such thing as one American rhythm. He says, if the great body of art and literature inevitably springs of the soil, it comes to flower in the city. Moreover, literature itself is as much a part of our experience as the raw environment of field and mountain. To cast aside culture is as great a folly as to cast aside nature, for in many they become one. So Austen wrote a repudiation of Mumford's criticism, which I don't think she ever published, and saying that her concern was with rhythm rather than with poetry as such, poetry for her being a derivation from rhythm, and that it hadn't been her intention to disregard poetry expressed in forms deriving from other rhythms. She also argued that Mumford's antipathy to her work was a result of the fact that she took a, quote, distinctly feminine approach to intellectual problems. All that I have ever as a feminist protested against is the prevailing notion that the feminine is necessarily an inferior approach. Now, there's a much broader issue here about the relationship between turn of the century women writers on Indian culture and the woman question. We should note the role of women translators of American Indian songs, the importance of the work of anthropologists such as Ruth Benedict, herself a poet, and the publication of imagistic Indian poetry in the 1917 Indian issue of the little magazine Poetry, edited by Harriet Monroe. In her editorial comment for that issue, Monroe argued that the approach to the literature should be a dual one, that of science, in this case anthropology and ethnology, and that of art. And the issue as a whole made the link between Indian songs and imagist poetics. The group of poets strongly associated with the new American poetic voice, Rachel Lindsay, Edgar Lee Masters, Carl Sandburg, poets sponsored by Harriet Monroe as a new school of Chicago poetry, were frequently invoked, as I've suggested, along with Amy Lowell, as the heirs to a Native American Indian poetics. While Lowell, for one, at times sought to distance herself from this connection, conceiving her polyphonic prose or free prose verse as markedly modernist in voice and form, she, like Austen, adduced climate and environment as well as character and race to be shaping forces on poetic traits. She writes, "The American is a highly nervous race, quick, impatient, energetic. Do we not find all these qualities in a marked degree in the new poetry? The American is naturally extremely sensitive to rhythm. He could not have invented or adopted the intricate syncopation of ragtime had this not been so. Only a poet with a strong sense of rhythm can cope with the difficulties of vers libre, simple as it may appear to those who have not studied its laws." Writing to Mary Austen about the American rhythm, the poet and editor Witter Binner expressed his doubts about your success as to establishing an Indian rhythm as basically important to the rhythm of American art. "I consider it immensely important relative to American life. The quick stepping rhythm of our national existence, the masks that cover our faces, the pathetic mistake that we are leading an animal life, the architecture behind our rhythms, the bright lights we wear on the streets of our bodies, the whole strange tom-tom of our existence. Yes, that is the American rhythm." Binner suggested that the American rhythm could be better related to, quote, Broadway, to haberdashery advertisements, to electric signs, to Ziegfeld Ballet, to nightclubs, and even to clairvoyant parlors up and down Manhattan Island, than to the quintessence of our life as exhibited, however badly, in Sandburg or you or myself. He also argued that American and English rhythms could not be separated, and that there is more influence, quote, from Queen Elizabeth down through Gershwin on Hopi Indian songs than on so-called American rhythm from any Amerindian whatever. He formulated an American rhythm as the rhythm of American and more particularly New York modernity, including jazz, while also finding the aboriginal in modern life, the whole strange tom-tom of our existence. This form of modernist primitivism is, of course, familiar to us, while Michael Goldstein's work on the racialized dimensions of writings on rhythm, as these were played out in the work of Yeats and Pound, has been influential in recent years. There is, however, more to be said about the ways in which concepts of and debates about rhythm became mobilized in the early decades of the 20th century in debates about national belonging, identity, culture, and art, as well as about modernity, mechanization, and the loss of organic being. We should also note that Mary Austin's claims for an American rhythm founded in the poetry and culture of an indigenous peoples arose simultaneously with the flourishing and increased prominence of African American culture, including jazz, disparaged by Austin, we recall, as a mode of spiritual disintegration. The properties of rhythm run throughout, for example, the essays in Alain Locke's collection, The New Negro, while the accelerated tempo of the machine age demanded and created new aesthetic forms, which were variously accommodations and resistances to its insistent rhythms. But that's a dimension of this topic which I won't go on to explore here, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm here. I'm just, I had cut my microphone and camera, and I'm fully here.
Did you go to sleep?
No, I was very interested, but and I will have questions. But before anything, I would like Lacey to respond to your wonderful paper. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you very much, Hélène. Thank you, Hélène and Caroline, for the invitation to participate in this seminar, which I'm delighted to do. And thank you very much, Laura, for that extremely rich, stimulating, and informative talk, and also for letting me read it in advance, which has been a great thing to do. I found your historical overview of rhythm science quite fascinating. I was unaware of Spencer's and Dewey's writings on the subject, and I now need to go and investigate people like Thaddeus Bolton and James Parsons, who also sound fascinating. So thank you very much for that overview, which was wonderfully rich. I'm also very grateful for your choice of texts from the Modernist period and for the angle you took on them. I looked a bit at HD and Lowell and Patterson in the very first conference paper I gave a very long time ago. So it's lovely to see them kind of flourishing in your work. And Mary Austin's discussions on rhythm were new to me, so I was very happy to discover them and to learn from your analyses and your contextualizations. And I think the project